Have you ever questioned how your imagination of who someone is so different from who they actually are? Or have you been, in a long-term relationship of some kind and gradually started to discover that the person that you fell in love with in your head is not exactly who they are in real life? If so, then this video is for you. Today I'm talking about projection, and I recently finished rereading this amazing book by Marie-Louise von Franz called Projection and Recollection in Jungian Psychology, Reflections of the Soul. And I'm just going to start by saying, kind of reviewing what is projection. So projection is often something that we're not aware of. And I'm going to read like an excerpt from Carl Jung describing what projection is. Just as we tend to assume that the world is as we see it, we naively suppose that people are as we imagine them to be. In this latter case, unfortunately, there is no scientific test that would prove the discrepancy between perception and reality. Although the possibility of gross deception is infinitely greater here than in our perception of the physical world, we still go on naively projecting our own psychology into our fellow human beings. In this way, everyone creates for himself a series of more or less imaginary relationships based essentially on projection. So, what does this mean? This means that, right, our perception of people is incredibly powerful, right? And it's really important. And this is something that comes up often in therapy, right? Is someone will share with me how they interpreted something that happened with another person. And I'm always thinking, how is that person's filter, right? How are they experiencing this interaction? And, I would imagine that if 5 other people were in that situation, I might actually get 5 different accounts of what happened, because we all look at things differently based off of who we are and our life experiences. And Marie-Louise von Franz talks about how we navigate the world sometimes without the ability to differentiate between the outer world and the inner world. And how, that's so important, right? It's really important what's actually coming from within us and what is like an objective external reality. But you can see this often in things like when a political figure is very angry at someone, and when they go on some kind of a tirade or a rant, if you look at what they're saying, a lot of it doesn't even seem like it's actually about that person, right? Like you can tell that some of this is maybe like their own internalized fat phobia, for example, or their own internalized sexism, like coming out in this really weird kind of sideways direction. And it's always a little easier to spot this in somebody else than it is to spot it in ourselves. But let's talk a little bit about how projection can form. So projection, we can see this sometimes in childhood, right? So it's often like how we perceive our parental figures. For example, like if you had a tyrannical father or a passive mother, then later in life you might also project that image, right, of like a tyrannical man onto someone or a passive woman onto someone. But what's interesting about that is like there also has to be a hook for the projection. So you wouldn't necessarily project tyranny onto someone who was like a very passive, kind of like weak type of man, right? But someone who might be the least bit assertive could hold that projection a little better, right? So often when projections are very present, there's a little bit of an element of, okay, hey, there's a reason why this projection is here, right? There's a hook for it. And then also like there's a big piece of the person's unfinished business that's coming out on this other individual. And if you're caught up in a projection, it's often not that comfortable. And it can be very disturbing to be hit with a projection from someone. And if you look at a show like Love is Blind, where people are, agreeing to get married without actually seeing each other in real life and navigating real life with someone, you can see the projection, right? You can see all the fantasy, all the imagining, how easy it is, right, to imagine who someone is and what your life will be like with them without actually living it. And that's why I would say actually projection is blind, not love. And I think a big part of relationships is actually us having to withdraw projections over time. For example, like when you start dating someone, often there is that thrill if there's, chemistry or emotional intimacy, that imagining of what could be, all the story that we're fed as children too of what you're supposed to want in a relationship, and we can kind of start envisioning that for ourselves and get away from kind of like the here and now and what's actually happening and the reality of this person. And what can happen is, that over time we get confronted with that person's limitations or the way in which they're different from what we projected onto them. So, if we think someone is like such a caring, loving, accepting, like kind of father figure type, then when they let us down, when they're not so caring, when they're not so accepting, that can be really difficult. But what's interesting is sometimes it's just hard to accept that someone is different from our projection onto them. And it can be really hard to withdraw these projections. And Marie-Louise von Franz talks about how we can often wrap our mind around when we're wrong about something, but if it's a true projection, it can be so hard to work through it and resolve it. And towards the end of her book, she writes that in Zen Buddhist meditation, the master tries to teach his pupil how he can forever keep the inner mirror free of dust, which is meaning that being able to reflect on themselves and see themselves clearly, as well as to see the world clearly, to be able to notice projections or notice, what is not objective, and to kind of just work through that. And it says here, to the extent that he lives in complete accord with the rhythm of psychic energy and with its regulator, the self, he has no projections anymore. He looks at reality without illusion and more or less continuously reads the meaning of all the synchronistic events happening around him. He lives in the creative current or stream of the self and has himself indeed become a part of this stream. Now, what I like too about this is she says, obviously, only a person with the most highly reflected concentration can achieve this. We average human beings, by contrast, will hardly be able to avoid the necessity for the rest of our lives of again and again recognizing projections for what they are, or at least as mistaken judgments. It seems to me, therefore, to be extremely important to bear constantly in mind, at the very least, the possibility of projection. This would lead to much greater modesty on the part of our ego consciousness, and to a readiness to test our views and feelings thoughtfully, and not to waste our psychic energy in pursuing illusionary goals. I really recommend this book, and I'll probably do another video on a similar topic. Thank you for listening today.